Welcome to the North Shore Fellowship Podcast, a place to explore the intersection of God's story with our lives. Welcome back. In our first podcast, we talked about the Gospel of Matthew, since we've been preaching through that for some time now, and now we're going to go back into the Old Testament and jump into 1 Kings. Heather, let me start with you. You've been around North Shore and for a long time. Why don't you tell us why we're going back into 1 Kings at this time?
Well, we typically start in the fall with an Old Testament book. And so this year we are in 1 Kings because we have covered actually from Genesis all the way through 2 Samuel. And so in the story of the Bible, this is where we're at in the story as we begin 1 Kings and the end of David's reign. So it's been fun, if you've been at North Shore for a long time, to remember that we started in Genesis and we've gone all the way through the story. And recently we got to see God's kingdom established with Saul being the first king and then King David. And now we're going to get to continue the story. But I do have a question, Jason, because a lot of people have been asking me, why haven't we finished Matthew? Because here we are in September, or end of August, beginning of September, we're starting in 1 Kings, but we haven't finished Matthew. So why in the preaching schedule didn't we maybe cram Matthew in more so that we'd be done with it before we started 1 Kings?
That's a great question. So I feel a little bit like we would be selling Matthew short if we had finished it and wanted to stay on the path of continuing to go back to the Old Testament for the storyline in the fall. But where we've arrived in Matthew actually gives us a nice little breaking point, because we just saw Jesus, the King, entering Jerusalem, coming to his people. The so-called triumphal entry is where we left off. And so as we think about the King who actually has come, we need to look at the other kings too. It's a good juxtaposition for us. From that point in Matthew back to 1 Kings. And we also have left a little bit of meat on the bone still in Matthew, and so we're going to go back to that during Advent. I'm really excited about that. We're going to see some of Jesus' teachings on his second coming, so stay tuned for that in Advent. We'll get to dip back into Matthew just a little bit more.
So we'll be celebrating his first coming and also looking at his second coming during Advent.
That's right, which is what the season of Advent historically is about.
That sounds exciting.
Yeah.
I'm also excited about jumping back into the Old Testament. I've loved preaching through it. I've loved learning so much from it. And what else is exciting is the story of the Old Testament itself. It's never without its turns and twists in the plot. What strikes me as I look back over 1 Samuel is how messy of a story it is, how dramatic it is. I believe at one point when we were going through 2 Samuel, John compared it to a soap opera. And I remember preaching on Mephibosheth, and you can't tell if he's a good or a bad character. Some of the things he's doing could be very deceptive and they could be very noble, and the book doesn't clean it up for us. And most of 1 and 2 Samuel is really about David. I actually wish it was called 1 and 2 David. That would help us all remember what's in 1 and 2 Samuel. But it's the story of David becoming king, and he's supposed to be this great king that we're looking forward to. And we look back to him as a great king, and yet, in context, he's not that great. Both because he's opposed from the outside by all these other characters, and also his own mistakes inside. So what we find in 1 and 2 Samuel, to me, it stood out as such a chaotic story. Such a mess. So, is it going to change as we move into 1 and 2 Kings? What can we expect?
Yeah, the chaos and the confusion that we see in 1 and 2 Samuel doesn't go away, and it gets worse because the greatest king dies at the very beginning of this story. His son is going to have a lot of successes, and there will be other successful kings, but even the successful kings are tainted by sin. And the Bible's not shy of showing us the flaws of its heroes. So there's going to be a lot of sorrow and sadness in this story. There's going to be a lot of displays of God's faithfulness, even in the midst of his people's sin. Ultimately, the book of 1st and 2nd Kings is trying to answer the question, why did Israel go into exile? And so the story that it tells is actually really, really sad. 1st and 2nd Chronicles is more or less the same material, but it's written for a very different purpose. It wants to guide them in restoration and renewal after they come back from the land. But 1st and 2nd Kings is saying, how did we even get in this problem of exile in the first place? So that's really the driving thrust of this. Like, why are we in such a conundrum? And once you see that purpose behind the book, it sort of makes sense that a lot of the bad things are going to be highlighted even more in 1st and 2nd Kings than they are in 1st and 2nd Chronicles.
So in one sense, 1st and 2nd Kings are a little bit of a how we got here story. They're context for the original readers. They would have been reading this knowing the end of the story, and at this point, when it was written, maybe not knowing that they would come back out of exile or how they would. But we read it kind of like we read the birth of Jesus and the crucifixion and his first coming in general. We read it in light of his second coming. And so we don't have to be completely bummed out and morose the way they were over these same events. We can learn from them in a different way. And so much of the Bible is like this. In that one sense, 1 Kings reminds me of Genesis. I think of it as a how we got here book, because the original readers were, Moses was recording that for the Israelites as they were exiting Egypt. And so for them, it was all history. And yet, as we read Genesis, it's certainly applicable to our lives now. And so, and even in the dark stories, we find lots of application. So even though we know that the historical trajectory as we go through 1 Kings is a turn down, we're still getting to learn a lot about how that happened, why that happened. We're getting to learn about our own repentance, and there's a lot to celebrate in the midst of it as well.
Yeah, the light of the gospel is never fully extinguished. So even in like one of the saddest books of the Bible, and Lamentation, you have right in the very middle in chapter 3, this beautiful little testimony to God's faithfulness, even in the midst of a horrible, horrible lament about what's happened to Israel. And so this is the historical events that preceded that disaster that Lamentation is grieving. So one way to say it, we've talked about the ending of 1st and 2nd Kings being really sad, but with just a very slight note of hope. If 1st and 2nd Kings was the only thing that we had, it would be a tragedy. But because we have the whole Bible, it becomes a comedy, at least in classic literary terms, where there's like this incredibly joyful ending where everything fits together. And you still have the gospel in the midst of it, even in all of Israel's failure. So we like to say that whenever we're looking at Scripture, or wherever we're studying it, 2 Timothy 3 tells us you can always look for gospel and guidance. You can always see God's work even in the midst of disaster, and then you can come back around and also learn what it is that you should be learning for your life, how you should live, how you should trust, how you should not be building your own kingdoms, but how you serve God's kingdom and use whatever gifts he's given you to steward to that end. So we certainly are going to take that away from the lives of these kings.
Jason, that's great. I want to go back to that part about the story being a comedy and not a tragedy. Of course, what we mean by that is in a comedy, there's a happy ending, and in a tragedy, there's a sad ending or a bad ending. And that gives us the ability to read this book, which has a lot of bad in it and doesn't have a good start or a good ending. And it allows us to read it in light of the whole Scriptures. And in light of the whole Scriptures, as you said, it becomes a comedy, not meaning that it's funny, but meaning that we know that there is a happy ending for the people in the story and for us. And that helps us really contextualize the book. Heather, before we started recording, you mentioned something about the character of the beginning of this book and how it sets you up to understand the whole book or the whole story.
Yeah, I just find it fascinating as I started studying this book and was looking through it, but reading the first couple chapters, and you think, oh, David is the greatest king, and so now he's going to pass on his kingdom to Solomon, and there's going to be this great thing that happens, and you find him sick in bed and not doing anything. And Bathsheba, Solomon's mom, has to come and say, well, are you going to make Solomon king or not? And it's just fascinating to me that these are broken people. and that God is using broken people to build his kingdom. It made me look up. I just wanted to see the Queen of England. When she became queen, it took 14 months to get her coronation ready. And so you'd think, like, the Queen of England, it just was interesting to me. And here is King Solomon coming, and there's barely any planning for him, and yet this is the way it starts. The same way 1 Samuel started, with Hannah praying for a baby. Just not what we would expect.
Yeah, or the book of Exodus starting with complete disaster when God's intention is to put these people in the promised land and have them multiplying and filling the earth according to his original design. Not a promising start, all kinds of problems. And then I think very often the way that these books are written, the solutions are not what we would expect, and it's not the book we would have written.
So this fall, before we get into Advent and go back into Matthew, we'll be looking at 1 Kings. And for the first 7 weeks or so, we'll be focused on Solomon. And I think a lot of us are more familiar with the story of Solomon, or at least when we hear it, it'll ring some bells. After that, we get a lot of kings' names, and not just one line of kings either. After Solomon, there's a northern kingdom and there's a southern kingdom, so there's always 2 kings on the throne in different places. And it gets really confusing. We're not as familiar with that part of the story. Jason, what can we look forward to as we get into the second half of the book of 1 Kings?
You can expect to see some attempts at renewal, and I think you learn a lot from that. You look at the life of Asa or other kings like Josiah who are trying to restore Israel and pull her back, and that's something that we always have to do. We always have to sort of go back to our roots and root out some of the problems that have the weeds that have kind of crept in and taken our attention off of the things that the Lord has for us. So that's very relevant for the Christian life today. We also see Elijah and Elisha, the importance of the word of the Lord coming in and, communicating, even if it seems like everything is against them. They have some really low points, even as like some of the most important people who ever lived. They are completely depressed or completely marginalized. And so learning from that your hope has to be in the Lord and not in your circumstances or the success of your ministry and or the success of your Christianity on a cultural or global level. All that stuff is really, really important for us to learn. We'll find a lot of that in the second half of the story.
I love looking at the lives of the kings, and I think this comes from teaching elementary kids and especially elementary boys who love to read these stories of the battles and the kings and all that. But I love looking at their lives in light of God's promise to David that his kingdom would be forever. And so with each king, you're thinking, is this the great king? Is it even Solomon? You're thinking, this is the King of Kings. And then he fails. And so with every king, you're looking to see, is this going to be the one that really establishes this kingdom and it's going to be forever? And it's just such a beautiful way of pointing to Jesus and to the king that we really need.
Yeah, so just as that happened hundreds of years before Jesus, we're living a couple thousand years after, and we always have to remember that Davidic promise does come to us. We will inherit the world and we will reign with him, but it always has to go through him first. And Heather's referencing 2 Samuel 7, this great promise that God made to David. David had big plans to build a temple and honor Yahweh and build his kingdom. And God said, I'm gonna actually do this in reverse. I'm gonna establish your son's kingdom. And he says, I will raise up your offspring after you, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. He goes on to talk about disciplining the kings, and that certainly happens in 1st and 2nd Kings. Ultimately, the great fulfillment of this isn't Solomon, but it's the one who comes from Solomon's line, and it's Jesus.
You just referenced the Davidic covenant in 2 Samuel chapter 7, which is a really important connection and context for the books 1st and 2nd Kings. What are some other connections to the rest of the Bible that are helpful to keep in mind?
We also learn when we look in context that kings have limits. A lot of places in the world, the king is a law unto himself. He can do whatever he wants. He can decide what the law is. That is not what we have in the Bible. And so it's really important for 1st and 2nd Kings to remember that it's coming after Deuteronomy. It's coming after Moses has given this legislation that puts even the king underneath the law of God. The king is supposed to write the law of God out by hand, Deuteronomy 17 gives us this instruction for kings so that they would remember that they themselves are subjects. And they're also given restraint on what kind of accumulation they can engage in. Unlike the nations around them, they're not supposed to heap up wives, wealth, and weapons. And so kings have limits on themselves from the law. It's really important.
I love looking and thinking about the kings having limits, Deuteronomy 17, and looking at their lives and their stories and seeing how God called his kings, the king of his people, to be so different because he called them to serve under him and to follow his laws. And I think that's where we can see ourselves in the story. We're reminded that as kings and queens of his creation, we also have limits. We're also called to serve under him, and that following his laws and his ways is good.
Well, thank you, Jason and Heather, for discussing 1 Kings with me this morning. That does it for this episode of the North Shore Fellowship Podcast.